Hello and good evening. My name is Johanna Leinius. I'm the scientific manager of the Cornelia Goethe Center for Gender Studies, who is one of the institutions that is organizing this first Bertha-Pappenheim guest lecture. The first thing that will happen today is that we have two welcome speeches. One will be by Professor Christian Wiese, who is also one of the main organizers of this guest lecture, who unfortunately cannot be here today. So he sent a video greeting. And then Professor Bettina Kleiner, who is the managing director of the Cornelia Goethe Center for Gender Studies, will follow with her welcome speech. And then we will give the word to Professor Elisabeth Loentz, whom we are very, very happy to welcome here to this first Bertha-Pappenheim guest lecture. So let me just change the video.
Dear Professor Loentz, dear Elisabeth, dear students, dear colleagues, dear guests, on behalf of the institutions that have jointly organized this event, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you who are attending this first Bertha-Pappenheim lecture on Judaism and gender. I'm delighted that you have joined us this evening. It is certainly no coincidence that the first lecture in this new tradition is dedicated to the life, thought, and actions of the person who lends her name to the Bertha-Pappenheim lecture and who symbolizes the often overlooked or underemphasized significance of women's history within German Jewish history and within Jewish history and culture in general. The famous women's rights activist Bertha-Pappenheim herself. I'm therefore particularly pleased that you, Elisabeth, have made the long journey from Chicago to share with us your outstanding research on this fascinating figure who is so special to Frankfurt's Jewish history as well. The idea to establish a Bertha-Pappenheim lecture originated in the joint international conference Revisiting Jewish Feminism, the Jüdische Frauenbund, a contemporary perspective on its 120th Jubilee, that I had the privilege of co-organizing in November 2024. With this conference, the institutions involved at that time, the Leo Baeck Institute Jerusalem, the Institute for the History of the German Jews in Hamburg, the Moses Mendelsohn Center for European Jewish Studies in Potsdam, also Boston University, the Wissenschaftliche Arbeitsgemeinschaft des Leo Baeck Institutes, the Buber-Rosenzweig-Institute, and also the Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland, marked 120 years since the Jüdische Frauenbund, the League of Jewish Women in Germany, was established in Berlin in June of 1904. The venue for that conference, the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, was highly significant. The museum not only holds important collections pertaining to the history of the Frauenbund, located at Bertha-Pappenheim-Platz, it also highlights the legacy of this outstanding woman founder and leader of the League. Frankfurt is where Bertha-Pappenheim lived most of her life, and this town became one of the organization's headquarters. The goal of the conference, shared by all organizers back then, was and continues to be, is to systematically write female experiences into the history of German Jews. The path-breaking volume Deutsch-Jüdische Geschichte als Geschlechtergeschichte, Studien zum 19. und 20. Jahrhundert, edited by Kirsten Heinzson and Stefanie Schüler-Springorum in 2005, and various other publications in Germany and on an international level have contributed to a better understanding of the relationship between German Jewish history and gender studies. However, despite these and other particular studies, the impression persists that the historiography of German and European Jewry has primarily centered on male figures and their endeavors while neglecting women's crucial participation in culture and society, and that research devoted to gender and Judaism in general, in different periods of history and in different geographical contexts, remains a most important desideratum. One of the central aims of the Conference on the Jüdische Frauenbund and also of this new tradition of Pappenheim lectures is to explore the ramifications and ongoing significance of this movement for 21st century Judaism and feminism. The theme of Judaism and gender and the scope of topics to be addressed by the Bertha-Pappenheim lecture is, however, by no means limited to Pappenheim herself or the phenomenon of Jewish female activism, nor to German Jewry or the modern period. It may, in the future, address a variety of other aspects of the abundance of potential research perspectives in the field: religious, philosophical, social, political, and cultural. The Buber-Rosenzweig-Institute has taken great interest in questions regarding Jews and gender, or Judaism and gender, in its teaching as well as its research. Several doctoral and postdoctoral projects have been or are being devoted to European Jewish or Israeli female intellectuals: Hannah Arendt, Margarete Sussman, Simone Weil, Activism, and many others. In 2020, the Institute was involved in a fascinating international symposium entitled The Female Side of God, Representations of a Suppressed Tradition, that included a variety of philosophical, theological, literary, and cultural approaches. In our long-term project, Buber-Korrespondenzen Digital, the digital analysis of Martin Buber's correspondence in the 20th century, reveals the wealth of letters between the philosopher and female correspondence partners during his lifetime. The first Pappenheim lecture on Judaism and gender is, according to my view, also an expression of our Institute's commitment to further accentuate gender aspects as a crucial and integral part of Jewish studies. I would like to conclude by expressing my gratitude, first and foremost to you, Elizabeth, Professor Loentz, and then to all the institutions and individuals involved in this wonderful collaboration. Let me start outside of Goethe University. I'm very grateful to Dr. Irene Auer-Ben-David, who served as director of the Leo Baeck Institute in Jerusalem for the study of German Jewish history and culture until February this year, and has since headed the Jewish Museum in Borne, and to her successor as director of the Leo Baeck Institute, Dr. Alexander Buber. For years, the Leo Baeck Institute has highlighted the history and legacy of German Jewish women, particularly early 20th century female activists and intellectuals. And it was Irene Auer-Ben-David who was my dialogue partner in initiating the idea of a joint Bertha-Pappenheim lecture. With this lecture, we are continuing a collaboration that has now spanned decades in a most meaningful way. I'm equally grateful to the Wissenschaftliche Arbeitsgemeinschaft des Leo Baeck Instituts, an association of German historians that has existed since 1989 and has since been instrumental in promoting research into and the presentation of German Jewish history. I would like to extend my thanks here specifically to Professor Miriam Rürup, the chair of the Arbeitsgemeinschaft. And Miriam Rürup is also the director of the Moses Mendelsohn Center for European Jewish Studies. My thanks go to her and her deputy, Dr. Werner Tress, for their contributions to the organization and for their financial support of this lecture evening. I would especially like to thank the entire team at the Cornelia Goethe Center for Gender Studies at Frankfurt University for their collaboration in planning and organizing the Bertha-Pappenheim lecture. Specifically, Professor Bettina Kleiner, Professor Heidi Lucia Liedtke, Professor Friederike Middelhoff, and Dr. Johanna Leiners. I'm delighted about their specific interest in topics related to Jewish history and culture, and very pleased that with this event we have been able to establish a tradition of interdisciplinary collaboration between Jewish intellectual and cultural history and gender studies, and that we will continue this tradition in the future. My gratitude also goes to my colleague Antonia Steins from the Buber-Rosenzweig-Institute for all her valuable support. And now I wish you all an exciting evening filled with good conversations, and I'm delighted to hand the floor to Professor Kleiner for her opening remarks.
Dear Elisabeth Loentz, dear audience, dear colleagues, it is my great pleasure and I feel very honored to be invited to welcome you all in my capacity as Managing Director of the Cornelia Goethe Center for Gender Studies to tonight's lecture and to introduce our esteemed guest, Professor Elisabeth Loentz. The Jüdische Frauenbund and Bertha-Pappenheim, as its very emblematic founder, stand for a long tradition of Jewish life in Frankfurt and at the same time for a long tradition of feminisms here. Looking back to the history of the Jüdische Frauenbund thus provides insights into the history of modern Jewish life and also into the history of the broader German women's movement, both Jewish and not. As Marion Kaplan has so prominently written in her important 1981 book on the Jewish women's movement in Germany, and I quote, "Studies on the German women's movement had not taken Jewish women into account, and historians who had researched German Jewish history usually did so with a focus on men. The German women's movement, that must be added, was not free of anti-Semitism itself." A central focus of Bertha Pappenheim's work was the fight for women's rights and combating anti-Semitism, advocating for Jewish women's visibility within the German women's movement, and speaking out against trafficking and sexualized violence. This granted her a pioneering role in the German women's movement, while unfortunately the problems that she addressed still persist to this day. Against this background, the Bertha-Pappenheim lecture seems to me particularly important because it will provide vital new insights into the connections of Judaism, feminism, and gender. It seemed essential to us to invite Professor Elisabeth Loentz as a speaker for the opening of this lecture series, as Elisabeth has been researching Bertha Pappenheim's activism since she finished her dissertation on Pappenheim over 2 decades ago. In 1999, under the supervision of Professor Dagmar Herzog, a professor for history and author of the recent book, Der neue faschistische Körper. Some of you will be acquainted with that book. Elisabeth Loentz is Associate Professor of Germanic Studies and Associate Director of the School of Literature's Cultural Studies and Linguistics at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's the author of Let Me Speak the Truth. Bertha Pappenheim is author and activist, and her major interests are German Jewish literature and culture from the late 19th to the 21st century, Yiddish in Germany, transnational and migrant literature, the portrayal of Jewish people and anti-Semitism in German film and theater, as well as the first German women's movement. She's currently completing a monograph on the meaning of Yiddish in Germany after the time of the First World War. Elisabeth Loentz's dissertation analyzed Pappenheim's large body of literary work and its relationship with Pappenheim's social work and activism, endeavoring to unpack moments of apparent contradiction that result from Bertha Pappenheim's multifaceted identity. The book is historical as well as a literary study, as Loentz places Pappenheim's literature in the context of her life as a Jewish and feminist activist of the early 20th century. As a review of Guy Miron states, Loentz's book is not just another addition to the several biographies already written on Bertha Pappenheim, but turning to cultural history, presenting Pappenheim's approaches to topics on the German Jewish agenda of the time. That's a quote. In her work, Elisabeth traces an interesting pattern. The positions Pappenheim expressed in her political and cultural activities were almost always ambivalent. Skimming through Loentz's rich work on Bertha-Pappenheim left me with the impression that Bertha-Pappenheim was a very complex and complicated person, and therefore even more lovely. She did not hesitate to address thorny issues. Her criticism never seems to have turned to one direction only. To give just one prominent example that appears again in recent work of Elisabeth Loentz, reading German Jewish feminisms through the lens of intersectionality. Although Pappenheim's work was dedicated to the Jewish case and criticized the German women's movement for the marginalization of Jewish women, she did not turn a blind eye to the role of Jews and Judaism in reducing women to sexual beings and making them susceptible to trafficking. These statements of Bertha Pappenheim, of course, were quite explosive at the time and still would be today. Elisabeth's 2023 paper, Jewish Women and Intersectional Feminism, shows Pappenheim's contributions to intersectional feminism avant la lettre, as the term and concept of intersectionality was only later in the 90s coined by Black feminists in the 80s and 90s. The complex performativity and style of an Elisabeth analysis resonate, in my view, with Pappenheim's own multifacetedness because her analysis revealed Pappenheim's own contradictions. These contradictions can be found, for example, in Pappenheim's relation to Eastern European Jews, for example. According to Loentz, Pappenheim worked on behalf of impoverished Eastern European Jews, but, and I quote, her own work was not free of the type of chauvinism that contemporary minority and post-colonial feminists have discerned in the women's movement. And that's what I found especially intriguing in your Elisabeth work, is that you reveal the contradictions in the work of a feminist who herself made contradictions visible. Recent work of Elisabeth Loentz turns to Jewish culture and to the question of how Jews and anti-Semitism are portrayed in cultural productions. Elisabeth analyzes, for example, the use of comedy in addressing contemporary anti-Semitism, as for example in the film Mazel Tov Cocktail, where you also turn to the question of anger and to the violent responses of the protagonists to anti-Semitism. Here, emotions come to play an important role, and we are eager to hear more about how theories of affect and emotion inform your new work. The topic of tonight's lecture, although in some aspects historical, is very much up to date, not only because of the current political situation, but as it also touches the political situation nowadays, I want to mention that this lecture is an important part of the program of Science Against Fascism, which is mainly taking place this week. Please check social media or the online program for further interesting events. Elisabeth's lecture also ties in with various threads in gender research that are being pursued at the CGC, where we host various and diverse approaches to gender and sexuality. Just to name a few of these threads that connect with the lecture in a broader sense. We had a colloquium in the last winter semester, in the last winter term, that was called Democracy Under Assault, the Rise of Authoritarianism from Gender Studies Perspectives, that was conceptualized by Dr. Veronika Duma, who's a postdoc at the Chair for the History and Impact of the Holocaust, and by Dr. Katharina Hoppe, Research Associate at the Chair of Sociology of Social Inequalities, and Dr. Johanna Wilmes, postdoc at the Research Unit of Social Pedagogy and Family Research. And we had a workshop on Jewish visual culture, Bilder des Jüdischen in Kunst und Medien in 2024, that was organized by Veronique Sina and the CGC in cooperation with the German Research Foundation at the Jewish Museum, Frankfurt. Last but not least, Elisabeth Loentz herself has contributed to our broad program. She was here 10 years ago, as we discovered, organizing a Bertha-Pappenheim evening tracking the traffic in June 7, 2016. That's almost exactly 10 years ago, together with Gudrun Meyerhoff, Rebecca Voss, and Iliana Renner. Hopefully we can strengthen such cooperation and conversation, and perhaps the discussions and meetings tonight will contribute to this. Before I finish my greeting, I would like to thank all those who do not so visible but very essential work, making this very concrete lecture possible. First and foremost, my colleague Johanna Leinius, Scientific Director of the Cornelia Goethe Center, who is an incredibly good organizer and coordinator, especially if things have to be changed last minute. Arturo Fernandez and Deria Toprikiaran, and also Antonia Steins for supporting the organization of this evening's main event. Thank you, all of you, so much. I now wish us a very inspiring lecture, and I'm very much looking forward to this evening's talk and discussions. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bettina, for the very kind words. And thank you to all of the hosts and all of the sponsors of the event. I am very delighted and honored to help open a lecture series named after Bertha-Pappenheim, who continues to deserve our attention as one of the most versatile, productive, influential, and controversial Jewish thinkers and leaders of her time. Among other achievements, Bertha-Pappenheim founded and led the League of Jewish Women in Germany and co-founded the International League of Jewish Women. She was at the forefront of the international campaign to combat human trafficking and forced prostitution, known at the time as white slavery or Mädchenhandel. She earned a reputation as an expert on the plight of Jews in economically depressed and pogrom-ridden communities in Eastern Europe. She established a home for endangered girls, unwed mothers, and their children. She advocated for refugees and immigrants, and she fought to improve women's rights and status in Jewish, religious, and communal life. In addition to her social work and activism, Pappenheim was a prolific writer and translator whose works include stories, plays, poems, prayers, travel literature, letters, essays, speeches, and aphorisms. According to her colleagues, they numbered about 2,000, but not nearly so many are available today. She also translated into German Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, as well as the memoirs of Glickel of Hameln and other Old Yiddish texts. She was discussed as a newsmaker and writer in German Jewish newspapers of every religious and political affiliation, and in German feminist publications. My choice of topic stems in no small part from current events in the United States. Two things prompted me to think about the role of emotion in activism. First, the representation of angry women at protests such as the No Kings events. My favorite examples of this are the pissed off grandmas. And the implication of these signs and groups is that emotions move. Our current administration has gone so far that even those who are supposed to be the sweetest and most mild-mannered among us, the grandmas, have gotten so angry that they were moved to action. And they aren't just angry, they're pissed off. Propriety, with this self-ascription, propriety in gender and role expectations have been thrown to the wind. And I can show you later a wonderful video of them singing if you like. But to save time, I'll just read a quote. We may have silver hair, but our voices are strong. We sing not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come. We never shout, we only sing. And every note is a protest. Second, is the prominent and visible presence of religiously motivated progressive activism, whether organized ecumenically or within specific religious communities and congregations. And this is very important, given the understanding that religious involvement in politics tends to come from the right. And this is absolutely not true. We have many progressive examples. And you may have read about protests against the inhumane conditions at the Broadview Detention Center during the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, Operation Midway Blitz in Chicago. With these photos, you see the pastor of my church with he's on the left, with 6 other faith leaders, 5 Christian and 1 Jewish, on their way to a clergy-led protest at Broadview. One of the group, Pastor Luke Ferry, was among the 7 clergy arrested that day. Luke was charged with obstruction, disorderly conduct, pedestrian walking on highways. In an interview with the Sun-Times, he commented that the Broadview mayor, Katrina Thompson, quote, said we came raising our fists violently, but I had my hands raised in prayer, saying I was nonviolent, and I was arrested. And when our neighbors are being abducted and placed in that inhumane facility, we have a call to show up and to try to come to their aid and to bring dignity and light to what's happening. Another of the arrested, Reverend Michael Wolf, also pictured here, I'm not sure what I'm doing, said, quote, what was going on in Broadview was a moral emergency and spiritual emergency. And after the clergy arrests, one organizer, Methodist pastor Christina Sinks, explained that it is the job of clergy to, quote, advocate for the oppressed, the vulnerable, and those dehumanized by any forces of evil and oppression. Although I mention only Christian and Jewish activists here, clergy and laypersons of many other religious groups also participate in protests and activism against the current administration. And I later learned that a young man whom I taught in Sunday school was also among the arrested that day. On January 7, 2026, Renee Macklin-Good, another activist who was reportedly motivated in part by religious beliefs, was shot and killed by ICE agent Jonathan Ross in Minneapolis while she was protesting a surge in immigration enforcement there. Her last words, directed at the agent who shot her, were, "That's fine, dude. I'm not mad at you." This statement is important for us. Anger and rage are emotions considered central to moving activists to action. Yet Renee Good disavowed her anger here. We should ask why. Pappenheim did not disavow her anger. She owned it, as you will see. I'm not going to assume that you're all well acquainted with Pappenheim's work, so I'll continue with an overview before I return to the question of affect and emotion in her activism. Her first forays into social work, mostly within the Jewish community, and her entry into what was called the moderate branch of the German women's movement coincided, beginning shortly after Pappenheim moved in 1888 with her mother from Vienna to Frankfurt, her mother's hometown. And this relocation followed the death of Pappenheim's father in 1880 and her own extended illness. In 1895, Pappenheim participated in the organization of the Frankfurt local branch of the General German Women's Association, called the ADF, becoming the secretary of its Association for Women's Education and University Study, although she herself never attended a university. In 1896, she participated in the Federation of German Women's Association, known as the BDF, Women's Militia, or Frauenlandsturm, campaign to improve women's rights in the new German Civil Code. During these years, Pappenheim's first publications appeared, Her translation of 18th century feminist Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, her first play, Women's Rights, and her first essays on social issues, social work, pedagogy, women's rights, and women in Judaism. At the same time, she was becoming active in local Jewish welfare activities. In 1895, Pappenheim became the substitute house mother of the Israelite Orphanage for Girls in Frankfurt, her first major post as an administrator and educator. And she's pictured here with her charges. The orphanage offered Pappenheim a socially acceptable venue in which to put into practice the ideologies of the women's movement. And it allowed her to carve out a space for herself as the mother of motherless children in a religious tradition in which single, childless women otherwise seemed to have no place. And I should mention here that a few of the girls in this picture became lifelong colleagues of Pappenheim, one of them, Helene Kremer. Conversely, the German women's movement granted Pappenheim the tools, platform, and confidence to critique Judaism from within the tradition and to demonstrate that it was compatible with feminism. In her first known essay dealing with these issues, The Question of Women's Rights and Careers for Women in Judaism, published in 1897, Pappenheim argued that Jews, having suffered the injustices of anti-Semitism, should be particularly receptive to the goals of the women's movement. Quote, like Jews, women demand only fairness, i.e., equality with those of equal capabilities. 5 years later, Pappenheim undertook her first practical attempt to merge the two spheres of her activity, Jewish social work and the German women's movement. Oops, there's Helene Kremer and her necklace, which recently found its way back to Isenburg. So 5 years later, she merged the two, Jewish social work and the German women's movement. And in 1902, she founded the local organization Women's Welfare, which coordinated the efforts of the local Jewish community, the city of Frankfurt, and the local women's movement to provide job training and referral services, legal aid, aid for nursing mothers, child care, a rail station mission, a girls' dormitory, and a girls' club, and a dormitory for Eastern European Jewish immigrants, refugees, and other Jews. Women's Welfare soon extended its work beyond Germany's borders, working with Jewish organizations to establish similar institutions and services in Galicia. In Women's Welfare and in other projects, Pappenheim played a significant role in modernizing Jewish social work, which was traditionally the realm of volunteers with goodwill, but little or no formal training. Pappenheim and other Jewish feminists active in the German women's movement, particularly in the Federation of German Women's Associations, came to realize that they were fully accepted in the movement only when they closeted their Jewishness. As Marian Kaplan has noted, quote, the BDF avoided what it considered to be sectarianism. Like most German liberals, it invited Jewish integration at the price of Jewish identity, and was decidedly uncomfortable in the face of Jews who resisted complete homogenization. In response to this experience of marginalization, Pappenheim called a meeting of Jewish feminists at the convention of the International Council of Women in Berlin in 1904, where she founded the League of Jewish Women, the Jüdischer Frauenbund, also known as the JFB, and was elected its first president. She remained president of the organization for 20 years and served on its executive board until 1934. The JFB joined the Federation of German Women's Associations, becoming its largest organizational member, and Pappenheim was a member of its executive board for 10 years. Admittedly, the JFB could never claim to unite all German Jewish women. The majority of members were middle-class, married housewives, and much to Pappenheim's chagrin, many prominent Jewish feminists in the general women's movement avoided the JFB. Pappenheim regretted that these women, who, quote, owed their intellectual tendencies, their keen intellects, and their sense for social action all to their Jewish origins, would take pride in joining the majority completely, and stake everything on covering up or erasing their belonging to the minority. Nevertheless, Pappenheim succeeded in uniting a remarkably diverse group of women. The JFB counted amongst its members Reform, liberal, and Orthodox women, prominent Zionists and vehement anti-Zionists such as herself. There was also a minority of single and married career women, such as Zionist Rachel Strauss, a medical doctor and mother of 5, who founded the JFB Home Economics School near Munich, and Pappenheim's closest colleague, the professional social worker Hannah Karminski, who lived in a same-sex relationship. Although its platform and projects, and here's Pappenheim with her JFB brooch. Although its platform and projects changed over time, reflecting Germany's changing political and social climate and economic conditions, the JFB remained steadfastly committed to the goals of the moderate German women's movement, tailoring these to the specific concerns of Jewish women and the Jewish community as a whole. A brochure portrayed the JFB platform as a tree whose branches represented its various missions and programs: care of the sick and aged, youth welfare, including the home for at-risk girls and unwed mothers and their children in Isenburg, which Pappenheim founded in 1907 and directed until her death, the protection of mothers and children, charity work within the Jewish community, participation in the Jewish community, including improving the legal status of women, women's work and women in the workplace, education, intellectual and cultural work, and the Sittlichkeitsbewegung, the campaign against immorality. At its height, approximately 20 to 25% of German Jewish women belonged to the JFB. In the 1920s, it had 34 locals, 430 affiliated associations, and about 50,000 members. In 1914, the JFB initiated the first International Congress of Jewish Women, at which the International League of Jewish Women was founded by Pappenheim and Sadie American, who were elected as its first co-chairwomen. Oh, and these are some images from the home of the Jüdischen Frauenbundes in Isenburg, and we can look at them, during the discussion if you'd like to hear more. Her leadership roles were not limited to women's organizations. In 1916, she published the article, "Woe to Him Whose Conscience Sleeps," which called for a national Jewish welfare association to coordinate Germany's numerous narrowly focused communal or independent social welfare and charitable organizations. Thanks in large part to her persistent agitation, the Central Welfare Office of German Jewry was established in 1917, and she was elected deputy vice president. She was also recruited by Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber to teach at the Free Jewish House of Learning in Frankfurt, and later collaborated with Buber in the Central Office for Jewish Adult Education, which sought to coordinate adult educational opportunities for Jews in National Socialist Germany. Pappenheim traveled extensively, both independently and as a representative of various Jewish or women's organizations, on research trips, and on what she called Agitationsreisen, on social work missions, and to national and international conferences. In 1903, she visited impoverished Jewish communities in Galicia to investigate the causes of trafficking. Her published report and recommendations on the condition of Jewish population in Galicia established her reputation as an expert on the social welfare of Eastern European Jewry and a leader in the campaign against trafficking. In 1906, she journeyed to sites of pogroms in Russia to assess losses and organize relief efforts. In 1909, she traveled to the Balkans, where she petitioned Queen Carmen Silva of Romania to join the crusade against trafficking. In the same year, she traveled to North America as a delegate of the JFB to the International Council of Women in Toronto. On this trip, she visited other American cities, lecturing on trafficking and touring institutions like Lillian D. Walt's settlement on New York's Lower East Side. In 1911 and 1912, she toured Eastern Europe, Palestine, Egypt, and Turkey, meeting with community leaders and visiting social work agencies, kibbutzim, schools, brothels, hospitals, and clinics for venereal diseases. Her letters chronicling these trips, which had the dual objective of studying the causes of trafficking and viewing Zionism up close, were published over a decade later in the collection Sisyphus Work. In 1926, she traveled to the Soviet Union to visit the Jewish agro-joint colonies. In 1934, she traveled to Glasgow, Scotland, with a group of children whom she brought to safety in the Gertrude Jacobson Jewish Orphanage. And I'm happy to say that I'm going to be in Glasgow in a week to do some archival work on this orphanage and this project. In 1935, she went to Krakow to advise on the administration of the Beis Yaakov schools for Jewish girls, which had been founded by Sarah Schneerer in 1917. And as a leading voice in the international campaign against trafficking, she also traveled throughout Germany and Europe to participate in conferences on combating the traffic in women. In hindsight, some of her beliefs seem old-fashioned or misguided. She spoke out against birth control, against abortion, and against women's suffrage, although she later fought for women's voting rights within the Jewish community. She opposed the professionalization of social work, although she can be credited with doing much to modernize and indeed revolutionize methods. She was a staunch anti-Zionist and believed strongly that Jews belonged in Germany, even after Hitler's ascent to power. In some ways, however, Pappenheim was ahead of her time, grappling with issues that are still topical: the trafficking of women, the plight of the Agunot, the integration of immigrants, and reconciling modernity, especially feminism, with traditional Judaism. Indeed, Pappenheim, who recognized a century ago that minoritized women, in her case Jewish women, had different concerns and a different experience of patriarchy than majority women, as well as a different experience of racism, in her case anti-Semitism, than minoritized men. Not to mention that feminists, despite their experience of misogyny, were not immune to anti-Semitism, and that Jewish men, despite their experience of anti-Semitism, were not free from misogyny, can be seen as part of the lineage of the African American and other minority feminists who developed intersectionality theory in the last third of the 20th century. Notably, the 1904 Congress, at which the JFB was established, also marked an important moment for Black feminists. In her speech, The Progress of Colored Women, Mary Church Terrell anticipated the theoretical insights that Black feminists articulated decades later. Quote, "Not only are colored women handicapped on account of their sex, but they are almost everywhere baffled and mocked on account of their race." Although Kimberly Crenshaw is credited with coining the term intersectionality, a larger cohort of African American, lesbian, and although they're seldom mentioned in discussions of intersectionality theory, also Jewish feminists shared in the debates that started in the 1980s about mainstream feminism's inability or unwillingness to grapple with difference among women and the complexity of multiple intersecting and mutually constitutive identity categories such as race, class, gender, ethnicity, nation, age, sexuality. Recognizing the marginalization of Jewish women, within both the male-dominated Jewish community and the sometimes anti-Semitic feminist movement, Pappenheim founded a German Jewish movement that was distinct from, yet integrated into, the German feminist movement. Although her writing is all but forgotten, Pappenheim was a well-known and respected writer in Jewish and women's circles during her lifetime. She was a prolific author of stories, plays, poems, prayers, travel reports, speeches, letters, essays, and aphorisms. She was also an accomplished translator. She translated into German the 18th century feminist Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, the Western Yiddish memoirs of her German Jewish ancestor, Glickel of Hameln, and Old Yiddish texts written for women. One of them you see to the left. In the middle, you'll see that her early play, Frauenrecht, was published under a pseudonym that she later ceased using. As Pappenheim's diaries and much of her personal correspondence were lost, the writings that do remain, especially the aphorisms, the travel letters, and the personal letters, especially those to Martin Buber, offer the best window, albeit a narrow one, into her personal life and personality. For example, her humor, her devotion to her colleagues, and the children and young women at the Mädchenwaisenhaus and at Isenburg, and her love for beautiful objects, which found its expression in her hobbies of jewelry making and searching secondhand stores for antique lace, beads, and Venetian glass on her travels. And here you see an announcement for an exhibition of her lace that she donated to the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna. There's one of the laces up to the left, and on the right is her portrait as her ancestor, Glickel, and she's wearing antique lace cuffs that I believe are part of her collection. And this is one of her aphorisms. Es gibt keine bessere Seelenberuhigung, als etwas künstlerisch oder nur kunstgewerblich Schönes zur intimen Betrachtung in die Hand zu nehmen. Okay. A good example of the lasting, I'm going to actually wait on that one. A good example of the lasting quality and the continued resonance of her work is the slim volume Prayers, which has appeared in 4 editions, most recently in 2003. Prayers appeared first in 1936, published by the JFB to honor the memory of their leader, and doubtless also provide German Jewish women spiritual sustenance to weather the trials of life under National Socialism. A second edition, in German with English translation, with a preface from a former colleague, was published in New York on the 10th anniversary of her death in 1946 for Pappenheim's, quote, disciples and co-workers who had found a new home in America. In 1954, the journalist Lily Marks, one of the original members of the reactivated post-war JFB, which set to work helping Holocaust survivors to reestablish Jewish life in Germany, also rediscovered the 1936 volume. Marx no longer remembered Pappenheim, but she and her colleagues, quote, soaked up the prayers like a sponge, and they released a 3rd edition. Decades later, in the 1990s, my paper is sticking together. A new generation of German Jewish women discovered Bertha-Pappenheim's prayers when the men and women of an egalitarian minyan in Berlin read one of them instead of a psalm. The reading left them speechless. Quote, it hit a nerve in all of us. We suddenly realized that a half century after the Shoah, there was still something, after all, that we could connect to, that we had our own tradition, our own ground on which we could stand and take our first steps. Until that point, the Minyan had derived its inspiration largely from American sources, attracted by what they called the revolutionary worldview expressed in Pappenheim's prayers, especially her dedication to social work and social political activism as Jewish worship, Gottesdienst, or a Jewish confession of faith, a bekenntnis. Elise Klapheck and Lara Demmich reissued the prayers in 2003. As I move on to the topic of affect and emotion, I should define my usage of the terms, and I should also tell you that I'm not a sociologist, and this is my first foray into affect studies, and I will approach the topic as a scholar of literature, so I'm looking mostly thematically at affect in the text and in her work. So the term affect generally refers to basic, often automatic or precognitive feelings or states linked to arousal, often physiological responses. Emotions, on the other hand, are more context-specific, conscious and sustained feelings that integrate bodily reactions with higher-level cognition and can influence thought, decision-making, and social behavior. Referring to Brian Masumi, Deborah Gould characterizes the relationship between affect and emotion. Quote, "An emotion is a personalized expression or account of the experience of being affected, an approximation, using, for example, language, conventionalized meanings, gestures, and what the body has experienced." Naomi Greiser comments on the use of the terms in affect studies. Quote, "Within affect studies, many scholars distinguish between affect and emotion. Usually, scholars regard affect as embodied and consider emotion to be narrated and social. Yet there is slippage between the terms because it is hard to maintain distinction between bodily intensities and social categories of feelings. Affect is palpable, yet hard to grasp. Many scholars have set out to grasp it, or at least track the productive difficulties of doing so. These efforts often begin with the problem of the archive and of identifying, isolating, and collecting emotions to study." End quote. Deborah B. Gould's seminal study, Moving Politics, Emotion and Act Up's Fight Against AIDS, offers one example of what Greiser refers to as the archive. In her study of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, Gould's archive is comprised of her own stories of her own involvement in the movement, interviews with members, a deep archive of newspaper articles and quotes, pamphlets, and photographs. Because of the passage of time and the destruction of Pappenheim's archive, her Nachlass, render it particularly difficult to pin down examples of affect or delineate between affect and emotion in her work, I follow Gould and others in the tendency to collapse the two terms into the term emotion. Sometimes people also collapse into the term feelings. Emotions play a vital role in creating and sustaining activists and social and political movements. First in mobilization, where emotions such as anger, outrage, and moral indignation can mobilize people to act against injustice. Second, in building collective identity, in which emotions play an important role in creating and maintaining bonds, fostering solidarity, shaping an individual and shared activist identity. In Effective Economies, Sarah Ahmet explains that emotions are not simply lodged in individuals. They circulate between bodies, texts, and spaces. Emotions such as anger or hope can do what she calls stick to an object, a community, or an idea. This sticking creates a sense of belonging and shared identity that is an integral part of activism. Third, in sustaining activist work over time, the emotional labor of activist work can result in exhaustion or burnout. Outrage is not sustainable. Thus, feelings of solidarity, shared purpose, and hope are considered essential in maintaining momentum and resilience in the face of challenges. In his introduction to Emotions of Protest, James M. Jaspers characterizes 5 types of feelings. 3 of these seem to me most important for our purposes. First, reflex emotions, the fairly quick automatic responses to events and information, often taken as the paradigm for all emotions: anger, fear, disgust, surprise, shock, disappointment, and joy. Affective commitments, which are relatively stable feelings, positive or negative, about others or about objects, such as love and hate, liking and disliking, trust or mistrust, respect or contempt, and especially moral emotions, feelings of approval or disapproval based on moral intuitions or principles, such as shame, guilt, pride, indignation, outrage, and compassion. Notably, the emotions that spark activism, especially anger and rage, are interpreted unevenly for men and women. And think back to Renee Good, who disavows her, and to Pappenheim, who doesn't. In their edited volume, Feminist Anger in German Language Cultural Production, Responses to Racism, Misogyny, and Other Injustice, Gruber and Range summarize, being angry as a woman is risky. An angry woman is subject to being ridiculed, ignored, demoted, declared hysterical and insane, or subjected to attacks in other ways. In her book, Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger, Soraya Shamali notes that, quote, as girls, we are taught that our anger will be an imposition on others, making us irksome and unlikable. Yet when men show anger, they are perceived by others as powerful. Yet angry women are perceived as unhinged and crazy when they display it. A woman who exhibits anger in, quote, institutional, political, and professional settings automatically violates gender norms. In her book, At the Scene of the Argument, Beyond the Trope of the Angry Feminist, Barbara Tomlinson elaborates on the double bind that activist women face. While Tomlinson is writing about contemporary US culture, the dynamic is not new, as I think we'll see with Pappenheim, and can be applied to her setting. And this is a long quote. Tomlinson writes, contemporary US political and academic discourse abounds with a recurring set of formulaic claims that feminist scholars and feminists in general are angry, unreasoning, shrill, humorless, ugly, man-hating, perverse, and peculiar. This trope of the angry feminist is designed to delegitimize feminist argument even before the argument begins, to undermine feminist politics by making its costs personal. Repetition and circulation of such tropes produces a cumulative, overdetermined quality that makes them seem already true before the moment of the argument. One never encounters the feminist argument for the first time because it comes already discredited. The trope of the angry feminist is thus not merely an argument about unseemly emotions. It is a tool of discursive politics designed to enact and reinforce patterns of social dominance. In The Aptness of Anger, Amaya Srinivasan notes that negative assessments of anger in activism are disproportionately applied to the anger of women and people of color, and that prevailing discourses surrounding anger tend to serve the interests of the powerful, deeming anger appropriate or apt only when it aligns with dominant norms. In her 1981 speech, The Uses of Anger, Audre Lorde addresses the power of rage in anti-racist feminine activism, while acknowledging Black feminists' justifiable reluctance to express their anger. She writes, to my sisters of color, who like me still tremble their rage under harness, or who sometimes question the expression of our rage as useless and disruptive, the two most popular accusations, I want to speak about anger, my anger. Everything can be used except what is wasteful. You will need to remember this when you are accused of destruction. Every woman has a well-stocked arsenal of anger, potentially useful, against those oppressions, personal and institutional, which brought that anger into being. Focus with precision, It can be a powerful source of energy, serving progress and change. And with this slide, I'm going to segue from Audre Lorde to Bertha-Pappenheim. And these are pictures of me and my daughter, who's now 18, at the Women's March in 2017. And we have some nice signs. We also have sashes that say feminist, and our signs are one from Audre Lorde, "Your silence will not protect you," and one from Pappenheim, "Not speaking out makes you complicit." And another quote from Pappenheim, I have at the bottom, is "Totschweigen kann eine Todsünde sein." And my daughter named our chickens after Audre Lorde and Bertha-Pappenheim, and I almost put a picture of them up there, but I thought better of it so you don't see the chickens. A 1932 prayer from the collection that I mentioned earlier encapsulates the vital importance of one emotion, rage, as a driving force in motivating and sustaining Pappenheim's activism. And this is a prayer written, dated in 1932. Grollender Zorn erfüllt mich. Ich will ihn behalten. Soll in mir brennen, solange das besteht, was ihn zu recht erregt. Ich will nicht nachsichtig werden. Ich will nicht blind sein gegen schädliches tun. Und ich will nicht entschuldigen, was unehrlich und unentschuldbar ist. Dass mir die Kraft bleibe, wieder und immer wieder in zorniger Wallung aufzurufen, jedes Unrecht zu ächten. Rage, in particular the righteous rage, summoned here by Pappenheim, is frequently recognized as one emotion that is central in instigating activism. It moves individuals to action and plays an important role in creating and fostering activist group identities and collective action. Scholars note the challenge of maintaining rage over time, suggesting that other emotions tend to replace its central role in the long term. But in this prayer, Pappenheim, who is 73, with a decades-long career in social work and activism behind her, and no real indication of slowing down, prays that she will not become complacent, but be filled with thunderous, burning rage, and have the strength to sustain that rage as long as injustices prevail. And what is more, that she will continue to have the strength to conjure that rage when she calls on others, time and again, to condemn every injustice. Friends and opponents alike commented on Pappenheim's passionate rage. Her colleague in the JFB, the statistician Dr. Cora Berliner, wrote in a memorial publication, "Es lebte ein Vulkan in dieser Frau, der ausbrach, wenn ihr Zorn gereizt wurde. Hatte sie Freude am Kampf? Zum Teil auch das. Denn wenn der Angegriffene sich zur Wehr setzte, seinen Standpunkt zu verteidigen suchte, ihr Ungerechtigkeit oder gar Selbstgerechtigkeit vorwarf, so kränkte oder ärgerte sie das nicht im geringsten. Im Gegenteil, sie fühlte eine gewisse Befriedigung darüber, den anderen aufgestachelt zu haben und sah die Wunden nicht, die sie schlug." Pappenheim's friend Martin Buber eulogized her in the same memorial publication. "Es gibt Menschen von Geist, es gibt Menschen von Leidenschaft. Beides ist nicht so häufig, wie man meint. Es gibt noch viel seltener Menschen von Geist und Leidenschaft des Geistes. Ein Mensch leidenschaftlichen Geistes ist Bertha Pappenheim gewesen. Musste sie nicht streng werden? Ach, nicht hart, nur streng, liebestreng und gewaltig fordernd und gewaltig zürnend, da doch alles so war, wie es war, und so blieb, wie es war." And I'll leave you to read the, it's not exactly a reaction, but it sort of encapsulates their relationship with one another. And for his part, Franz Rosenzweig called Pappenheim a geniale Kratzbürste. In addition to passion and anger, Buber observes Pappenheim's severity and demanding nature. The words severe, demanding, and combative appear frequently in others' remembrances as well. Notably, Pappenheim's acquaintance with Buber began in 1916, when she wrote him to criticize the first issue of his journal, Der Jude. What began with her attack developed into a close friendship built on mutual respect and affection. The severity, passionate rage, and readiness for combat that were admired, respected, or at least understood by her female friends and colleagues and Buber was interpreted differently by male opponents and even some male collaborators. Rabbi Georg Salzberger, a collaborator, wrote in his memoirs that Pappenheim was the tüchtigste und bedeutendste Frau with whom he had ever worked, but also that she was unverheiratet und Männerfeindin. And here you have one of her reactions to this. Die Männer sind so eitel und durch Generationen in der Beurteilung ihrer selbst so verwöhnt, dass einer die sachliche Kritik einer Frau an seinem Tun und Verhalten nur als allgemeine Männerfeindlichkeit empfindet. Rabbi Cäsar Seligmann recalled in his memoirs, mit Männern vertrug sie sich schlecht, wenn sich die Männer nicht ihrem Willen und ihrer Führung unterordneten. I would like now to introduce an example of how Pappenheim used her position as chairwoman of the JFB to voice her righteous rage in a deliberately inflammatory speech that was designed to fire up supporters while at the same time goading and inciting the ire of mostly male critics. Pappenheim gave the speech titled On the Morality Question at the second Delegates Conference of the JFB, which was held here in Frankfurt. The multi-day event was very well attended and extensively covered in the Jewish press. According to reports, the auditorium could not accommodate the throngs who wished to attend Pappenheim's opening speech. I quote the speech at length to give sense of Pappenheim's voice and also how our listeners might have encountered the speech. And the emphases are mine. Wir Frauen aller Kulturländer, wir wehren uns heute dagegen, vor dem Gesetz mit Idioten und Kindern gleichgestellt zu werden, weil wir die Wirkung dieser Zurücksetzung als Hemmschuh unserer Entwicklung erkennen gelernt haben. And note here the repeated use of wir and unser. Und die jüdische Frau? Seit Jahrhunderten genoss sie innerhalb des jüdischen Gemeinlebens seiner Kultur- und Kultuswelt, die für die Juden lange Zeit fast identisch war, noch nicht einmal die Rechte eines 13-jährigen Knaben. Der 13-jährige Knabe, ein Kind, empfängt die Weihe der Selbstverantwortung. Er wird in die Gemeinde aufgenommen. Bei Gebetversammlungen zählt er mit. An Ritualgebräuchen nimmt er teil. Er hat Anspruch und Anteil an der Torah. Er kann die reine Lehre aufnehmen, sich in ihr stärken und begeistern, sein sittliches Empfinden verfeinern. Und die Frau in der jüdischen Gemeinde, sie zählt nicht mit, sie gilt nichts, sie lernt nichts. Ihr Geist braucht keine Kraft und Anmut. Sie darf nicht einmal schön bleiben, selbst wenn er die Naturschönheit als Geschenk in die Wiege gelegt. Sie muss sich verstümmeln oder doch entstellen. Vor dem jüdischen Gesetz ist die Frau kein Individuum, keine Persönlichkeit, nur als Geschlechtswesen wird sie gewertet und beurteilt. I should note here that newspaper reports reveal that Pappenheim did use the term Geschlechtswesen, and she refused demands to revise the offensive term to Gattin und Mutter in the published proceedings, where a footnote indicates that the text was edited against her wishes, eine Polemik zu vermeiden. And the speech continues. This is the next of the citations that's particularly offensive to her critics. Aber eine Unzahl junger Jüdinnen und die finden sich zumeist in Russland und Galizien, gibt es, die oft noch im frühesten Elternhaus der Prostitution verfallen. Auch das ist erklärlich. Diese Mädchen wissen, dass sie nur einen Geschlechtswert haben. Ihre Individualität, ihre Wünsche und Neigungen können sie nur in den seltensten Fällen geltend machen, weil dazu eine Kraft und sittliche Größe gehört, die nicht alltäglich ist. Und so wird Rivkele Schepschowitz im Gott der Rache eine erklärliche Erscheinung. Für das Empfinden dieses Ghetto-Geschöpfes kann es, abgesehen von der Verlockung, die sie reizt, wirklich recht gleichgültig sein, ob für sie oben ein langfristiger oder unten ein kurzfristiger Vertrag gemacht wird. Basically putting together prostitution and marriage. Here Pappenheim references a recent theater scandal with which her audience would have been familiar. Yiddish playwright and novelist Sholem Asch's 1907 play Gott von der Komme premiered in Germany on March 19 and ran through September in the Berlin Kammerspiele. It was the first Yiddish play to be performed in a major theater in Germany. At a private reading of the yet unpublished play, Peretz implored his younger colleague to burn it. Why? The play takes place in a Jewish brothel, where the brothel owner's supposedly pure daughter, Rivka, who lives upstairs in an ostensibly respectable home above the downstairs brothel, is seduced in a quite graphic portrayal by one of his also Jewish prostitutes. Years later, in 1923, the producer and cast of the English-language Broadway production were arrested on obscenity charges. Jewish critics in particular objected to the portrayal of Jewish involvement in prostitution, a same-sex love affair, and the idea that a rabbi would participate in a brothel owner's attempt to purchase respectability by commissioning a Torah scroll. Emotion-laden responses, both positive and negative, to Pappenheim's provocative speech were immediate, and it spurred extended engagement in the local, nationwide, and Austrian Jewish presses. On October 11, 1907, the Neue Jüdische Presse reported on the reaction of audience member Rabbi Dr. Jakob Horowitz. He was a leader of communal orthodoxy in Frankfurt and served as vice president of the Union of German Rabbis. According to this report, der Redner wendet sich sodann in eindringlichen Worten unter großer Erregung gegen die Behauptung von Fräulein Pappenheim, die Frau sei im Judentum nur Geschlechtswesen. Seine Ausführungen gipfeln in den Sätzen: Ich denke viel zu hoch von der sittlichen Würde der Frau, als dass ich nicht in dieser Behauptung eine Schmähung des Judentums erblicken müsste. Die Kette unberechtigter Vorteile gegen unseren Glauben ist wahrlich groß genug, als dass wir sie noch um einen Ring verlängern brauchten. Als Fräulein Pappenheim erregt erwidert, sie sei es dem Andenken ihrer Ahnen schuldig, den Vorwurf zurückzuweisen, antwortete Herr Rabbiner Dr. Horowitz: Die warmen Worte, die Fräulein Pappenheim soeben gesprochen hat, haben mich genauso ergriffen wie Sie. And the warm words were not in the speech, they were part of the conversation. Pappenheim seems to have deliberately chosen the word Geschlechtswesen to provoke, and this provocation hit its mark, triggering strong feelings in our audience, which were met in kind. Horowitz speaks urgently and unter großer Erregung, which can be translated as exciting, agitated, infuriated. He states that her conciliatory words haben ihn ergriffen, meaning that he was touched, moved, or seized. Notably, this conflict did not prevent future collaboration. Pappenheim's Sisyphus work, too, contains correspondence from 1925 between Pappenheim and Horowitz, in which he reports that he recommended at a meeting of the Union of Rabbis that the Welthilfskonferenz should engage intensively in the campaign to combat trafficking. And he asks to meet with her to discuss the matter further. The two passages from Pappenheim's speech that I shared so enraged listeners that they employed the Jewish press to accuse Pappenheim of Jewish anti-Semitism and promoting anti-Semitism. And I should add here that over the course of her career, Pappenheim repeatedly encountered Jewish leaders who either refused to acknowledge Jewish involvement in trafficking, both as traffickers and trafficked, or were well aware of it, but cautioned against anti-trafficking work because it would air Jewish dirty laundry. So here are a few examples. Noemi Barnett accused Pappenheim of jüdischen Antisemitismus. The Israelitisches Familienblatt condemned her of using ein hässliches Wort, das zu dem berufsmäßigen, gehässigen Schmähern des Judentums Wasser auf ihre Mühlen führen muss. Isaac Unner wrote, welche Förderung man dem Antisemitismus damit gewährt, braucht wohl nicht näher erörtert zu werden. And the Israelit criticized women who were willig, sich einer Führerin zu unterordnen, die keine Gelegenheit vorübergehen lässt, dieses Judentum in den Staub zu ziehen. Leaders of Frankfurt's secessionist Orthodox community were so outraged by Pappenheim's remarks that they founded their own Jewish women's organization, the Israelitische Frauenverein, which Pappenheim derisively called a Männerverein in Frauenkleidung. The founding of this group marked the start of a decades-long emotional afterlife of the 1907 speech for Pappenheim. A month after the speech, she held another speech at a meeting of the Women's Welfare, in which she again selected words that were certain to raise the hackles of her antagonists in the Austrittsgemeinde. The text of the speech is not extant, but the fighting words are preserved in reports of a libel suit brought against Pappenheim by teachers of the Orthodox Israelitische Volksschule. The Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums reported on the libel suit and the offending or offensive passage. Am 7. November 1907 hatte Fräulein Pappenheim im Verein für weibliche Fürsorge, einem Appendix des Israelitischen Hilfsvereins, einen Vortrag gehalten. Es handelte sich um die Stellungnahme zu dem in Bildung begriffenen neuen Frauenverein. Fräulein Pappenheim bemerkte, dass der neue Verein viel Gutes tun könne. So könne er sich auch um den Räder in der Bärenstraße kümmern. Wegen dieser Äußerung erhob der ganze Lehrkörper der orthodoxen israelitischen Volksschule gegen Fräulein Pappenheim Privatklage, die heute das Schöffengericht beschäftigte. The teachers claimed also that Pappenheim had called the school and them minderwertig and called the Frauenverein a Männerverein in Frauenkleidung. When Pappenheim was acquitted and the teacher's appeal was not successful, the offended parties accused Pappenheim of having einen fanatischen, geradezu an das Pathologische grenzenden Hass gegen das traditionelle Judentum, der sie völlig unfähig macht, zu seinem Gedankeninhalt vorzudringen. And recall here the pathologizing of angry women and feminists, which must have been particularly wounding for Pappenheim, who herself had a history of mental illness. The charge of hatred is also notable here, because Pappenheim very rarely wrote about it. The one time that she did write about this emotion was in a letter to Martin Buber in 1935, in which she explains her understanding of loving one's neighbor, Nächstenliebe. She writes, ich könnte jemanden hassen und verachten und ihm helfen, doch nicht lieben. Ich will auf meinen warmen Hass nicht verzichten. Ich hasse die Rabbiner, die die Frauen als minderwertige Gottesgeschöpfe hinstellen. And there's a footnote, sie lügen, that goes to a number of these. Ich hasse die Zionisten, die ein Land ohne Ehre und Gerechtigkeit nur politisch aufbauen wollen. Ich hasse die Gemeinde- und Organisationsfunktionäre, die sich ethische Mäntelchen umhängen und im Schnepfenkartell fett werden. Ich hasse die 1933er Juden mit ihrer frisch lackierten Tradition und wahrscheinlich noch viele andere, denen ich unweigerlich beistehen würde, wenn sie mich brauchen. And I'll skip the next part. Meinen Kindern erkläre ich das Gebot der Nächstenliebe ähnlich wie sie mir. Aber es ist mehr. Es ist auch der Hass dessen, was nicht liebenswert ist. Punkt, Gedankenstrich und voraussichtlich Schluss dieses so unmodernen Briefwechsels. And here I will point you to an article by Abigail Gilman. I think it's out already on Pappenheim's concept of Nächstenliebe. The hateful critiques lobbed at Pappenheim after the second Delegiertentag caused a decades-long simmering resentment and disappointment at being misunderstood. Shortly after the 2007 meeting, Naomi Barnett, was a Zionist, wrote in an article published in the Jüdische Rundschau, quote, das einzige Wort, das ihn, den Delegiertentag, skizzieren könnte, ist ein großes Schade. A full 27 years later, Pappenheim wrote a set of self-obituaries for a book planned but never realized by Kurt Tucholsky. Wie stellen Sie sich Ihr Nachruf vor? Each of Pappenheim's self-obituaries that she attributed to various German Jewish newspapers, the Familienblatt, the Israelit, the CV-Zeitung, Jüdische Rundschau, Blätter des Jüdischen Frauenbundes, including the one that published Barnett's article, end with the exclamation, Schade, certainly quoting that article. And that echoes, the shadow echoes Tucholsky's use of ach instead of Schade. The two shown here are my favorites from the Familienblatt. Sie war eine Frau, die jahrzehntelang eigensinnig für ihre Ideen eingetreten ist. Ideen, die in der Zeit lagen. Aber sie tat es oft in Formen und auf Wegen, die einer Entwicklung vorgreifen wollten, so wie sie auch nicht nach jedermanns Sinn und Geschmack waren. Schade. And the Israelit, nach Herkunft und Erziehung eine orthodoxe Frau, die im Lauf der Jahrzehnte und unter dem nachweislichen Einfluss revolutionierender Gedanken der Frauenbewegung von ihrer Wurzel loszulösen vermeinte, sich oft feindselig gebärdete, sie aber doch nicht verleugnete. Sie hätte ihrem Jehus nach, wir erinnern daran, dass ihr Vater Mitbegründer der Schiffsschule in Wien war, der Orthodoxie bessere Dienste leisten müssen. Schade. While I focus thus far on negative emotions, I'd like to finish with the more positive feelings that sustained Pappenheim's activisms over decades, namely hopefulness, gratitude, and love and affection. First, hope. From Dankgebet einer Alten, written in 1929, herrlich ist es bei sinkender Sonne, Ehren zu sammeln, ob sie dem Brote dienen, ob sie Saatgut werden. This prayer can be interpreted as Pappenheim's assessment at age 70 of her life's work, reading the sinkende Sonne as life's approaching sunset, and pondering the longer-term positive outcomes, those that will outlive her, of the mostly female lives that she affected through her social work and activism. How will these women carry on her legacy, either as mothers in other vocations or by continuing her work? Let's see. Sorry. The next one captures the deep affection that Pappenheim held for the children in her care. The Isenburg Home for Endangered Girls and Unwed Mothers and their children was the project that was closest to her heart. After her mother's death, she moved to Isenburg to be closer to the home and spent most of her days working there. In this prayer, she expresses gratitude for having had opportunity to save the endangered, who represent the hope for the future. She also alludes to the opportunity to experience, as a childless woman, some of the joys of motherhood. This poem, I say poem because they sound like poems, but this prayer reads, ein kleines fasst mein Finger und rauft mich an Scheitelhaar und lacht über den gelungenen Angriff, dass seine 2 Zähnchen blinken. Ich bin so froh, dem Menschenkeimchen getroffen zu haben. Dem Menschenkeimchen ein Schutzdach geschaffen zu haben. Vielleicht wäre es sonst im Schmutz zertreten worden und wir wären um eine Hoffnung ärmer. Wie gut, dass sich das Menschenkeimchen und ich uns im Weltall getroffen zu haben. Wir wollen es unserem Schöpfer danken, das Glück der Liebe und des Lebens. And in another Denkzettel she writes, man muss die Kinderkeimchen als Ausgangspunkte von Möglichkeiten werten und beobachten. And I'm going to close with Pappenheim's words of thanks. And it is a final prayer that addresses affect directly. Here she gives thanks late in her career and life, she's 75, for continuing to find the words to move others to join her in the work that she was moved to pursue. Danke auch für die Stunde, in der ich noch für das, was mich bewegt, Worte fand, dass ich andere damit bewegen konnte. So, thank you very much for listening, and I welcome any comments that you have and any questions.
Thank you so much for the illuminating portrait that you painted, and also for your comments on kind of connecting it to the current political climate. I found that very insightful. So I have a question on Pappenheim and her interlocutors within the Jewish Bund, in the Women's Bund. You describe her as having an antagonistic relationship at once with non-Jewish feminists who are anti-Semitic, and with Orthodox Judaism and the way that they regard her. What was her discourse with the women that she worked together with like? Because a lot of the opinions that you pointed to sound like they might have been controversial to her friends as well. And was she more of a listener there? Was there like a safe environment in which they discussed these topics? What was she like as an interlocutor to her?
So I don't really have enough information to say whether there were safe spaces, because I only have what's, extant, what has been written, what she wrote about saying, what others wrote about her saying, and a lot of this is missing. But I can say that she sometimes shied and she sometimes didn't shy. So there were points where she, got so angry that she, resigned as chairwoman or something like that. And there were, of course, Zionists in the movement who disagreed with her. One famous instance was in the 1930s when she called Henrietta Soll's efforts to get children outside of Germany, also to Palestine, as Kinderkreuzzüge. So there were lots. She changed her mind, obviously. In fact, she had planned late in her life to go to Palestine. She was talking to Buber about that, making plans, where she was going to go, who she'd meet with. So she clearly revised that, and she also took the children to Scotland. So she changed her mind on that one. But of course, that's very inflammatory. So she didn't shy away always from that, but she called herself, and this is very interesting, she called herself neutral. So she called herself sort of free of parties. And this was something that she wrote, that she could be a leader for these reasons. And she had stepped down at one point, but then offered to resume leadership of the movement in the 1930s because she thought that they needed someone like her who was what she said, unparteiisch. And I don't have the full quote at hand, but she says something like, I'm not liberal, I'm not reform, I'm not orthodox, I'm not Zionist, and she lists a couple of other things. So she said, you know, for this reason, I can bring everybody together because I do not, you know, because I am ostensibly neutral. Of course she wasn't, and was an anti-Zionist, but this was her thinking on that. And there were times, there are a few documented cases where she shied away from being too provocative. So the play that I showed you, Tragische Momente, is an anti-Zionist play, and it takes place partially in Frankfurt, so first in Russia during pogroms, then in Frankfurt, then in Palestine. And she said she let, you know, somebody, they wanted to stage a play by her. And she said, oh, well, let's not take this one because, and I think it was something like, wir wollen nicht Zündstoff zwischen den Damen streuen, something like that. So she said, you know, we don't want to inflame the ladies, so we're not going to do this anti-Zionist play. So.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really fascinating, and also the parallels you drew with the present was fascinating as well. Yes, sorry. I had just a quick question. When you mentioned that she was an anti-Zionist, does she use the category herself, or is it a sort of like contemporary reading of her work?
I don't think she does, and right now it's hard for me. It's a long time since I've worked with some of this material, so it's hard for me to kind of rewind, you know, all the documents through my head. But I don't think that she uses that term. It's just very clear, you know, from her work that this is the case. And in that play, for example, very clear. She's obviously saying, you know, even when she shows Palestine, you know, shows that she doesn't believe that this is the correct answer. And you can always email me and I can send you citations if you're interested. But she was very interested. So like she said, she was trying to keep an open mind, and that's why she went. You know, and she talked to a lot of people. She went to places like Bezalel, where they, you know, it's sort of an Institute of Applied Arts, was interested in working with them to improve their lace patterns. So, you know, she was, you know, quite involved with efforts there. But it was not, you know, she was very much against Jews viewing themselves as a nation or a people. She talks about a Stammesbewusstsein, and that's as far as she goes as in looking towards Jews as a nation or people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Just a brief question. Do you know whether she traveled to Canada as well?
She was in Toronto. So
in Toronto.
She went for the conference. And I don't know if she went to other Canadian cities because I've been looking at I've been trying to look at American and Canadian, you know, Jewish publications.
Yeah.
But I didn't do that when I was working more intensively.
Okay.
And I really want to do that as maybe a separate little article because I've read about, you know, in historians' writing, she gave these speeches, but they don't have good citations on that, the people who've written that.
Yeah.
So I really would, in the future sometime, like to track that down.
Yeah, just a following up question. I mean, there was a large Jewish community in Montreal.
Of course.
And there is a recent study about, I think it's by Tara Goldstein, about Leah Rollback. Probably you have heard about it. She was an activist, but she was younger than Pappenheim. She was born in 1903 in Montreal. And actually the public Jewish library in Montreal, they have an exhibition on Leah Robeck. Quite interesting figure. So that's why I wanted to know if there's any connection.
I'll definitely make a foray, because this time I happen to be going to Scotland after this, because that's where my partner's from, so we go visit family. And then I thought, I've never had a chance to track this Glasgow thing down, so I'll go ahead and write the archives. And they were incredibly, accommodating, and I have an appointment to meet with them next week, so I'm very excited to see what I can find out about that. But the the US and Canada is something I'd really love to see.
If I may ask one real quick question as a follow-up on Alexia's question. So in the Jewish and the Christian religious tradition, there's a lot of skepticism towards political social work, right? It's supposed to be charity. And there's also a lot of skepticism in certain religious camps against Zionism in Judaism. So I was wondering, what's her relationship with religion? Does it play a central role in her idea of charity? And does that motivate some of her skepticism towards political movements?
So for her, she didn't like indiscriminate charity. So she really wanted charity to be very much, directed to work. So not just, giving money, but, when I read off the huge number of projects that she was involved in. So for example, I didn't mention the unentgeltliche Flickschule. So actually in 1895, she made a mending school, which now is like on trend again. But this, once again, she was interested in helping people to help themselves, and she was very interested in education. So she didn't like as much to view traditional charity. What she was interested in was something different. And the professionalization of social work, that was a tricky question with her, because she was developing, professionalized methods. Very late in life, she used the decades full of case studies from Isenburg and commissioned someone to do a study of what happened to the girls and children after, they left the home, so Kedemende. And so she was very interested in that, and is considered important for the development of casework. However, she said either social workers should be volunteer, or if they're professional, they should be paid little. So, of course, I'm sure her colleagues, her professional social work colleagues, were probably not too crazy about that, but it was an idea that she had, that this should be Liebesdienst. So it shouldn't be something that one could make a lot of money off of and then just do because that was a lucrative profession. So it was, like many things with her, it was tricky. Yeah. Like you said, it was tricky. Mm-hmm.
Okay, if there are no more questions or comments, are there? We'd like to close this with a big thank you, Elizabeth, for your talk. Thank you for your attention, and I just wish you all to have a great evening and a great home. Thank you for coming here.
Thank you.